Anytime that you cannot hear me, just raise your arm and I'll try to remedy. I would just like to say one other word about how we developed our autism. And then we'll spend the rest of the session talking about where we go from here. One of the things that strikes me as an historian and studying Western civilization, the more I'm convinced that the episode of the Black Death that occurred in 1347 to 1349 had an important role to play. At that time, something like a third of Europe died. And in some cases, in less than 3 months, as in Siena and Florence, well over half the people died in that period of time. Suddenly, during the summer months of 1348, more than half the inhabitants of Florence and Siena died of the bubonic plague. By September, only some 45,000 of the 90,000 people living within the walls of Florence were still living. Siena was reduced from about 42,000 to 15,000. Never before or since has any calamity taken so great a proportion of human life. The plague struck again in 1363 and once more in 1374, although it carried off far fewer people than the terrible months of 1348. The survivors were stunned. The Sienese chronicle Agnolo de Torre tells of burying his 5 children with his own hand. No one wept for the dead, he says, because everyone expected death himself. All of Florence, according to Boccaccio, was a sepulchre, and so forth. It was a terrifying experience for which they had no explanation. They knew nothing at all about germs. Their only way of dealing with it was as regards moral causality. The conclusion that they drew was that the world had become wicked, humans had become wicked, God was punishing the world, and the best thing to do was to get redeemed out of the world. The spirituality of the period changed decidedly, and it's my overall view that we never have recovered spiritually from the experience of the plague, and that this is the background. Our spirituality in the last part of that century, and the art changed. The wonderful, clear naturalism of Giotto changed, and the religious scenes depict Christ condemning the dead with his arm outraised, striking the condemning into hell. The art changed in a very extensive way. For the first time, you get these judgment scenes, you get the Last Judgment scenes, you get the depiction of distorted corpses and so forth. the new motives appeared in art that had never appeared before. And the spirituality changed. It was a very spiritual period. The 15th century is when the dance of death was developed. The ars moriendi, the art of dying. There were 40 treatises on the art of dying that circulated at the period. The morality plays developed, the everyman, the idea that nothing is worthwhile except what you take with you when you die. And so we developed that alienation from the natural world. It was particularly difficult for Christians because of the millennial promises at the end of the book of Revelations of St. John. There, the course of history is described in terms of the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, crowned with 12 stars, with the child and the dragon, seeking to devour the child, and the strife was to continue through history. It was John's effort to tell Christians that although they were convinced that the Messiah had come, that the peace and the serenity, the abundance, the justice that was promised in the reign of the Messiah was not in evidence. The early Christians thought in many instances that the end of the world was coming within their lifetime. Some people stopped working. That's why St. Paul in the epistle to the Thessalonians, I believe, or the Galatians, had to say, if members of the community don't work, don't let them eat. So he had the problem of accustoming our Western civilization to history and to the tensions and strife and the continued sorrows of time, you might say. The Western world experiences the afflictions of time, what we call the human condition, more sensitively than other civilizations, because we're promised more. We're promised in our sacred books, we're promised the peace and wonders of 1,000. The dragon is to be chained 1,000 years. That's where the millennial idea comes in, before the end of time. And then the dragon is to be released for a time and half a time, and then comes the translation of the earthly Jerusalem to its heavenly setting. And then paradise comes for the redeemed. Because of that 1,000 years, because of millennium, there's much more expectation in the historical order in the Western world. In other parts of the world, I think you can see where people have developed inward capacity to accept the difficulty of life. The West seems to have an inner rage against the human condition and a quest to and feel that it's unjust. We shouldn't have to go through the tensions, the difficulties, and so forth. We can't stand it. We're sensitized to it. And this millennial expectation is what's driving our economics. Dynamics of economics is non-economic, it's visionary. We're looking for Wonderland. And that's why the Disney world appeals to people so much. For them, it's a kind of a shadow, almost a promise of the millennial beatitude of this millennial age. And that is what drives the industrial economics. That's why we're seeking more and more. The more the stock market rises, this is wonder. We're getting to wonder world. And America is leading the way. We're taking humanity out of the desert. We're taking them to the Holy Land. But the Holy Land we now think of in terms of consumption. And we tend to identify it with all that comes through the extractive economy as the support of it. That's why you can't even see. You'd think the universities would be teaching this, that their economics, they'd be telling the younger people, look, you need to deal with this, particularly in the economics thing. You'd think that in our legal structure, our jurisprudence, we begin to see that there's no future for the human except in a intimate relationship with the larger community of existence. You'd think that the university would be teaching this, and like now, teach history. You can't teach history anymore in terms of simply of the Greek, Mediterranean world, Roman world, then on into the period of what you call the Dark Ages, those 6 centuries from the 5th to the 11th century. You can't, and then on the Middle Ages, and then that we're into, as Brian explained. We are into this transition of geo-biological order. History now, we are at the terminal phase of the Cenozoic. We need to be taught history in its planetary dimensions. And this is no longer kind of a choice. Well, you can teach it this way. If you're going to teach valid history, this is what you have to teach. The other is, we need to teach that too, but that's microphase history. We're into macrophase dimensions across the board in everything. In the questions of social order, the society now is not simply human society. The society is the society of the planet Earth. We have to have a new dictionary. We need an Ecozoic dictionary. We need an Ecozoic religion. We need an Ecozoic education, Ecozoic economics across the board, Ecozoic medicine. There's somebody now in Toronto, somebody in the medical field that's doing this, and actually this is happening now. This study of health now has to go into the study of the planet. It has to be a planetary health. If we are thinking this way now, amazing things are happening now as regards the human and our relationship to the other than human components of the great society of the planet Earth. The other than human components that determine the human. But we have to determine it. We now have a branch of veterinary medicine for wildlife. We have to take care of the health of the wildlife. Not simply domestic animals, but the wildlife. The animals they have illnesses now that we have to treat from our medical profession. So you can see that across the board, things are happening. If we don't get the order of magnitude, we are using inadequate answers for significant problems. It's like treating typhoid fever with aspirin. Alleviate a little bit, but it certainly isn't dealing with the basic issue. So, saying that, where do we go from here? Hey, Brian, where are you? Tell us, will you? We need somebody to tell us, where do we go from here? Well, My own invention is to think of the new age, the new geobiological period. I call it the Ecozoic. Somebody else may have used that. I don't know. I suspect they may, but I dreamed it up one day. And I now identify our issue. How do we move from the terminal Cenozoic to the emerging Ecozoic? How do we move our educational program from the terminal Cenozoic to the emerging Ecozoic, and across the board? The medical field, now there's environmental illness now. We're into new dimensions of illness, and we have to move our sense of health into health in the Ecozoic era. Ecozoic economics, Ecozoic religion, so forth. Ecozoic government. And I talked to people at the Secretary General's office of the United Nations. We need, beyond United Nations, we need United Species now. We have the species economics and economics of interspecies, not just internation relations or intercontinental, but interspecies economy, interspecies health, because this is the only reality. But we have become so accustomed to these more limited frames of reference that we don't appreciate the larger context. But we'd expect universities, we'd expect religious people to be able to deal with this, because that's the purpose of a university, purpose of religion, is to deal with the big issues and the definitive issues. And these are definitive issues. And as I was saying before, this is the great work. Now that's the great work now that's ahead of us in every field. The great work to which everybody is called is this transition. The great work. Now, what's a great work? Every people, every age has a great work. Outside of the specific work of individuals or groups or so forth, there was, when this country was founded, what was the driving force was what was called the manifest destiny. And we praise those that were conquered the desert. I came to this continent with the strangest idea of conquering. Can't get it out of our heads. It's an often thing. Here were Europeans coming across the sea, apparently having what they considered the finest spiritual tradition, finest religious tradition ever invented, the finest humanistic learning tradition, the finest political stance, the best laws, and all of this. And come to this continent, and then after they've been here a few centuries, the continent's in ruins. It's contaminated. Species are dying. Everything. Why? Well, they came here. They had the little black book telling them all the spiritual truths they needed to know. They didn't need to learn anything. We didn't come to learn. We didn't come to join a society and a governance that already existed here. We came to exploit. Anyway, that's the basic idea. But how do we go into this new period? Everything in 15 minutes. Let me say it this way. Now, some of you, I'm sure, have heard this, but it won't hurt all of us to hear it again. My diagnosis of our situation is in 3 sentences. My solution is in one sentence. So, simple. You come here, you'll know all the answers. But the three sentences go this way. In the 20th century, the glory of the human. How many have heard this before? Oh, a good many. In the 20th century, the glory of the human has become the desolation of the earth. First sentence. Second sentence. The desolation of the earth is becoming the destiny of the human. Third sentence. All human institutions, professions, programs, and activities must now be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. That is the definition of the Ecozoic Era, a period when human presence would be mutually enhancing. Human presence on the planet would be mutually enhancing to both the human and the other components of the planet. So, yes. The third sentence, yeah, that's a big one. All human institutions, professions, programs, and activities must now be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. And that now is the central focus. Now, as I mentioned before, that's us. Now, the one sentence, with 7 phrases. All your problems solved, one sentence. Well, let me talk something about historical mission. The mission of the Greek world was to create the special mode of the human learning process and the humanistic basis of Western civilization. The great work that began with the Homeric period and carried through with the tragic writers, and then also with the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, so forth. Roman, to give an organizing principle of political life over an area. They were the first ones really to establish a structural context for a community of nations. And it was the Roman order, the Pax Romana, was a rather admirable thing. In the time of the Greeks, the Greek world politically could not think beyond the city-state. They couldn't even think of, they had a league of cities, but you belonged purely and simply to a city. That was your allegiance. That was your political identity, and there was no other context of containment or of association except by kind of extrinsic treaty. But with Persia first, they started the larger, but Rome was the first one really to do it in a significant way, to relate nations or peoples. The Middle Ages was to establish a Christian world, a religious world. There were 6 centuries when the cities died out in Europe. There are no cities in Europe, functional centers that we would call cities. I can't think of any. It was life continued in the great castles, in the great monasteries, in these great political unities that were focal points of kind of a heroic age. But the Middle Ages was the great work of medieval Europe to create a civilization with the arts. They created the universities. The Middle Ages created monumental thought tradition. It's the Middle Ages that made science possible by disciplining the Western mind. The Middle Ages, people that talk the high Middle Ages down have no idea what they're doing, because it was among the most creative ages that humanity has ever known. And, a lot could be, but that was a great work. Now, at that period, there's a story told about 3 men carrying stones. First man was asked, what's he doing? And he said, I'm carrying stones. Second asked, what are you doing? He said, I'm supporting my family. Third was asked, what are you doing? He said, I'm building a cathedral. That was the great work. The cathedral was the symbol. It was the physical embodiment of a people, of an ideal, of a destiny, of a purpose in existence, and a celebration. It was constant celebration in the Middle Ages. It was one of the most ages where celebration was most extended. We have very little celebration relative to other civilizations. In the Middle Ages, they had 54 celebratory days in addition to Sundays and feast days. But coming to our age, we have a great work. And inevitably, I talk to university students or college students, and inevitably somebody stands up and says, what can I do? And I said, well, what do you like to do? What are you talented for? And so forth. This is not something for some special group of people. Certainly not for ecologists. It's not for this group or that group. It's across the board. Everybody is involved. We're all carrying stones. We're all supporting families. But beyond all that, there is the work of the age, the work of the period to move the society. That's why we have to protest. We have to assume, in a democratic way of life, we have to assume the responsibility for the society, for the destiny of the society, and for the future. Now, how would I further identify this? Well, I would say it this way. The historical mission of our times, it's something that might be worth taking down. So those of you that would be that think you might could use it. The historical mission of our times is to reinvent the human. That's the first phrase. Second phrase, at the species level. With critical reflection. Within the community of life systems, in a time developmental context, by means of story and shared dream experience. We've got to dream our way out of our situation. It's not something, because what we are experiencing now is the consequence of a distorted dream. It's a distorted dream. It's an illusion. Our whole society is dynamized by a distorted dream that's turned into destructive directions. We dream that we're going to have a better life. We're creating for ourselves a worse life. And people that think that we are bringing a better life to people throughout the world, we're not. Of course, and when people talk about that they want everything we have and all that, this is after we have already corrupted and broken up their native ways of life. The Indians of this country, they felt sorry for us. And I have a piece here somewhere of we've ruined the beauty of their life. And you could tell, you're reading the documents in the earlier colonial days, that you could tell how close an Indian lived to a white settlement by the disreputable appearance. He didn't keep himself neat. He lost the neatness. He became less presentable. If he lived further, he would be presentable. He would be neat and so forth. It was anything but the type of savagery that we generally associate with people. In some instances, it would, of course, be people would be living at a generally lower diet, or perhaps with some of the difficulties they might experience, but on the whole, and certainly one of the worst things we did was stop them celebrating. I don't like to go to papers, and I'm sure I might not have the one here that I should read, but it's an order. I don't have orders from this country. This country did the same thing, but in Canada, they also were fearful of the dances of the Indians. They put out a long decree that the authorities, the Euro-American authorities, were to stop the Indians from dancing, stop them from celebrating, stop them from wasting their time, stop them from doing all these pagan things. And in this country, John Muir went to Alaska 5 times. The first time he went in 1878. He went to an island off the coast of Alaska, and the Indians there put on a superb dance for him. And in that, they imitated the animals, and it just a marvelous dance. But after the dance, the chief spoke to Muir, and he told him, "This is the last time that we're going to perform this dance. We're going to give away our ceremonial garments." Why? Because we have learned that this is not the right way. We've learned the Jesus story, and we know that all this now belongs to our darkness. We have been enlightened now. Well, here is where, and this is something a person has to think about. The way I phrase it is this: good people are dangerous. All this is done by good people without the proper reference of what's good. Good people are dangerous, and I say the better they, because good people without an adequate idea of what's good, The better they are, the worse the consequences. I'd rather deal with bad people. But it's more likely a bad person allowed to do something good than a good person with the wrong idea of what's good. He's dangerous. So Westerners are terribly dangerous. Now, this sense of us coming to this country without a willingness to learn the spiritual teaching of the forest, the spiritual teaching of the wildlife, this is where the deep, the numinous element comes through to us, to our poets and musicians, and to all of us. And it's what children should be initiating spontaneously. They experience this mystery, they experience this beauty, they experience this depth. You don't have to teach a child to appreciate hearing a mockingbird sing in the evening. You don't have to teach anybody to how to experience the ocean. The child rushes out, he wants to immerse in the wavelets and so forth. So that this is that context of things. But when we came to this country, that was blocked off. And largely, it was the result of the Black Death. The 15th century got this spirituality of alienation, and we kept it till our times. And it's largely a consequence of this, supported by the other religious developments in these centuries that are basically responsible for where we are now. And it's the attitude pervaded all the instruments. But going back to this statement, this sentence, we need to reinvent the human because more than any other being, humans invent themselves. We're genetically coded toward a further transgenetic cultural coding whereby we become human. Genetic coding teaches a bird how to build a nest, how to carry out mating rituals, how to find their food, all that. They don't have to think about it the way we do. They know. So when a cult, and now how to do all these things constitute our culture. But we have to think about it. We are genetically determined to think. How we think, how we use our thinking is cultural. We're genetically determined to live in society, but how we fashion our society, we invent. And so with all the other aspects, we're genetically determined to do things, but how we do them, we invent. Now, when it comes a time like this, I say we have to rethink of what it is to be human at the genetic level, because none of the cultures of the world are adequate for this new situation which we find ourselves. So that's the first thing as regards the Ecozoic Era. I term this new cultural phase the Ecozoic Era. I give it a geobiological context so that we would see the proper order of magnitude of what we have to do. We need to reinvent the human at the species level. Now, we have to go back to our genetic coding because there is a connection. It's what Carl Jung spoke of as the archetypals. There are the archetype. There is a predisposition, like the predisposition to rebirth ceremonies. Humans need to be reborn spiritually and culturally after their physical birth. There are a number of other things that tend to be pan-cultural and which are a result of archetypal modalities like the sense of the Great Mother, the sense of the mandala symbol. There are a great many of the basic symbols that seem to have an archetypal continuity between the genetic and the culture, and to bond these two together. I think myself that the Chinese have the greatest overlap because they're constantly concerned with what you do before you think. And the ideal of culture is to so influence a person towards, say, right action. It doesn't have to think. The ideal is to know instinct and do it with delight. Virtue is not to do something that you have to force yourself to do, but when you do things with delight and spontaneity and immediacy, that's virtue, we call it. Our habits. Now, but we need to get into this deeper level. We need a transformation. Now, this would be equivalent to the creation of a new religion earlier. We can't do that anymore. But this, I call it meta-religion. We need something now that will be the horizon under which all human affairs take place, and by which they are the context in which they come to meaning. Now, so we have this reinvent the human at the species level, because we have to go to the spontaneities that already exist within the human, wherever a person is, although the cultures differentiate. With critical reflection, we can't do this any longer simply spontaneously. In prior ages, there was, I would think, a certain spontaneity that we no longer have. We have to think more like with some of our adaptation to the natural world, we have to do it more analytically, as far as I can tell. Now, but we know the keystone element of this 7 phrases, the 4th one, is within the community of life systems. That's the key. We must become members of the planet Earth. We must become functioning members of a life community. So that is that's the basic thing. The most basic thing we need to do is to get out of our exploitive attitude into a participatory attitude. And then the next is, in the time developmental context, we live in historical periods of transition. The largest context is the context that Brian Swim gave us this morning, that we have now become a planetary force, and we must assume the responsibilities that go with that. And then, by means of story and shared dream experience, our sense of the universe we live in now is given to us by story. And that, I think, Brian Swim and I have been the first people to write the story of the universe story out of contemporary scientific data. Other scientists have written essays about the universe. Carl Sagan did some wonderful thing in his book Cosmos. But he was writing largely about how we know the story of the universe more than the story of the universe. Somebody came from England to visit me a couple of years ago and was a bit upset by the way we had written it, in the sense that we didn't put in equations and all that. And he said, don't you think it's a little arrogant to write a book like that? No quotations, no footnotes, no equations, no quotations, and all that. Well, I said, oh, don't take it so serious. It's just a story. Take it or leave it. But the other thing, then I said, oh, Homer didn't put any footnotes in either. And that account, it's a very, very important book because it's the epic of our times. Every age produces, I think, some epic expression of itself. Homer with the Odyssey, Iliad and Odyssey, give expression to the ideals of an historical period. You have with Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, he wrote that to interpret the Augustan Empire, which was Rome at the height of its achievement. It needed an interpretation. And so Virgil wrote the Aeneid. And these are stories. His story of Rome is the interpretation of Rome. Now, the city of God of St. Augustine is the epic that founded the medieval period. Rome was burned in the year 410. The accusation was made. The empire had become Christian by that time. The accusation was made that the Christians had taken away the worship of the gods. The gods were angry and therefore had given Rome over to destruction. Somebody had to answer that. Augustine spent 12 years writing The City of God, which he told the story of the whole human community. And then he told the story of the historical tension between the city of good and the city of evil, or the creative city and the destructive elements of the human. And he projected on into the future. And that book, together with the ritual books of Christianity and the Bible, created the Middle Ages, you might say, together with the book of Boethius, which was the Neoplatonic spiritual teaching. So that the Gospels, the ritual books used for ceremonies, the City of God of St. Augustine, and the Dionysius, which gave the spirituality, they provided the guidance for the great work. That was the story. Then the Middle Age, you get Dante, who did a fantastic thing. I think Dante was probably the most learned person ever in Western civilization, because he wrote this poem. He put everybody in, real people, a whole look over the course of the human, and he put it in 100 cantos, a large poem, put it into the Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, but in it he worked in the whole human story, such as it was known in his time. But in our times, we need a unifying story. The story creates a community. Community creates a story, but the story, in a sense, creates a community. It's the story of America that creates America, and the story that drives this country is the story of a people. I don't know if we have a single truly outstanding story, but the story is there, and we tell it in different ways. But now we need the planet story. because we have the knowledge now. We've done the geographical work, the inquiry into the geological structures of the planet. We've done the inquiries into the universe, how the planet Earth came into being, how the solar system. And Brian just has this brilliant way of presenting this sequence of things that develop. Well, I don't think as regards the story, I don't think that part of the book that we wrote will be improved for a very long time. He has such lyric powers of expression and such depth of comprehensive scientific knowledge that I'm quite sure that that is not going to be substantially improved. The human story, particularly the early phases, will be changed somewhat, is being changed, and but certain sections of that and the way it's written fits into these general ideals of what I'm saying. So that we have now the epic of the universe, including the epic of Earth, the epic of life, and the human epic, in a way which was never possible before. Now, this is the, what you might call the perspective in which we function. But as regards the future, we need the dream. The dream drives the action. The dream guides and drives the action. We have to dream of the Ecozoic Era. We have to, that's why it's so important. We can only overcome a distorted dream by a more valid dream. We cannot reason our way out of this type of a distorted vision that has gripped our society. But as it reaches impasse after impasse, and we're in that situation now, impasse after impasse, then we're going to reach it governmentally and economically and health-wise and all that, because it is not integral, not an integral context. We need the dream, and the dream has to be guided by the phrase that I mentioned, a period when humans will be present to the planet in a mutually enhancing way. Now, it's most encouraging to feel that this is in process. This is in process. This is not something that we have to invent any longer. It really began in, it can be dated from 1962, when Rachel Carson wrote her book, Silent Spring. Ever since then, when she identified the devastation of this miracle component, chemical, DDT, we have known that the planet and the life systems were endangered on an extensive scale. And beginning there, a whole series of things have taken place. In 1972, 10 years later, it's the first time the nations of the world gathered together to discuss the relationship of humans with the planet. And that took place in Stockholm in 72. Presided over by René Debow and so forth. And it didn't accomplish a great deal, but 90% of the nations there went back and set up the first environmental protection agencies. Now that same year of 72, a very important book came out called Limits to Growth. Growth is a magic word, development, and limits are not considered. But that book, which was denounced as the Silent Spring was denounced, and things generally in this area are constantly being denounced. But things began and developed. Since then, we have nature writers, people that give us that feel for the natural, people like Barry Lopez, but most of all in this century, I think Lauren Eiseley, E-I-S-L-E-Y. He is, I think, the most competent and has written most profoundly of appreciation of the natural world within this functional relationship with the human. And there's a long list of them. But in every profession, in architecture, Richard Register, who has done so much in rethinking how to design human habitation, how to redesign existing cities. He's on the West Coast. He's just finished the third of 3 big international conferences, one in this country, one in Asia, one in Africa. The one in Africa just concluded, the proceedings were just published, but people from the villages all over the world, I don't know, there were several hundred people there from villages presenting the sustainable communities as they were experiencing it. This was people from these areas contributing how to establish sustainable, where you have your food, where you have your water, where you have your clothes, where you have the basic human needs taken care of in a functional context. So then there are people like Vandana Shiva from India, who does such remarkable work in critiquing some of the distorted agriculture that has entered in the human process, and it makes a person, or it calls the person to reflect on the fact in this country, our scientific agriculture is the worst agriculture ever invented by humans. It ruins the soil. Its consequences are awful. Its nourishing qualities are not integral. The whole process is ruinous to the land. And then the Green Revolution that was put out several years ago, 10 or 15 or maybe 20 by now, but it was supposed to answer the problems of the food supply of the world because you could produce so much, but the cost was terrific. You couldn't do small scale things. You had to do big scale. You had to have a lot of water for irrigation. You had to have endless fertilizer and all that. You disrupted societies, and then we lost the varieties of our grains. We have lost our seed varieties on which our food depends. We've lost about half of the genetic basis of our food supply because of our scientific agriculture as we see it. So we have these people, though, people like Vandana Shiva. We have the critique now. We have the education. There's Tufts University has formed an association of university presidents throughout the world, over 200 of them, to pledge their universities to an integral literacy, earth literacy, to be required of all their students. So I could go through all the different areas and identify for you the people like Kirschenmann, Fred Kirschenmann, who has this farm in North Dakota, who has introduced large-scale organic agriculture and is organizing the reordering of agriculture in the upper Midwest. Now, A person, I go through the agriculture, architecture, education, David Orr, with earth literacy as the basic context for college, university education, so forth. So what I would leave you with is a feeling that that there's a great work to be done. It's in process. We have finally the grasp on what happened that brought about our situation. We have the enthusiasm that is awakening throughout the world, not just throughout this country, but throughout the world, this type of understanding is being developed. And when I said that this is the issue, that this is, in a sense, the comprehensive issue, and that we need to get on. Particularly for the younger people, they need a challenge. Younger people need something that makes life difficult, but that gives them purpose. They have purpose. Younger people can do anything, endure anything, survive anything. Their purpose, sit before television. They don't like that any more than anybody else likes it, but there isn't sometimes anything else to do. And they need these things. So, what I leave you with then is a sense that there is an issue, we know how it happened, we know what to do about it, and let's get on with our collective dream. So long.
We have time for one or two questions, but not until you get your heads closer to the earth. Everybody stand and face that door. Okay, any questions for Thomas now that your heads are closer to the earth? It's all right if you don't. We'll have at least one more. Yes, young lady back there. Your name? Good and loud. I believe she wants to know if you can speak in such spiritual terms to people today whose philosophies are more jaded and are used to understanding things in sound bites. Is that right?
Yeah. Whether the spirituality can be communicated. Yes, can it be communicated in our society as it stands today? Well, I think myself it is being communicated. In fact, the whole ecology movement has, as far as I can tell, a pervasive religious spiritual tone. The subject itself is of that nature, and the and it lacks that type of piety sometimes that people associate with spirituality. But when it comes to basic insight into what I call the numinous dimension, which is the sacred dimension of the universe, they have an immense reverence, and it is available. The world of the sacred is available for everybody. And most people, even people that a person has to challenge or be at odds with, people in corporations, people that it is a challenge, and much of it is has become very harsh, because this is such a harsh issue of people that have staked their money and their lives into cutting down trees, into devastating, like in this state. The hog farmers who've done such damage feel insulted by the ecology people that says, don't poison the rivers. But the legislature just barely gets enough nerve to insist that industrial hog farms come under the proper zoning, that they should, and that they not ruin the natural water systems that are in the area. Now, this, but the industrial people, the large corporations, what do? They buy up space in the newspapers, and they put in the advertising. They get the writing. They get the legislature to be sensitive. They say, we make jobs. If you restrict us, then the economy will suffer. And they put up all these dire consequences if you try to have them behave half decently. Now, this issue is of that nature, but that's, in some sense, I would say it's almost an excitement that almost makes you feel like, taking out your extra nerve with fighting with people. It's hard not to develop a kind of a bitterness and not to develop the antagonism, but to stay with patient, educational, challenging, but strong processes, and critical, and not let people get away with ruining the property that belongs to all of us. Now, one of the ways in which we are all victimized is by the fact that advertising is tax exempt, advertising expense of business. We support that. There's no reason why businesses, they're advertising, and it's through their advertising that they pay the salaries of the big sports people. They pay for a lot of things with our money. And the media, they control the media. They can buy up the media and advertise themselves endlessly at our expense, because the advertising is tax exempt. So, and the government, the corporate, what a person has to understand. And here's where it really is, I'm glad you brought this up, and I'm sure the kind person, well, I'm sure there's a thing. But one of the things that I suggest people read, there are two books particularly right now. One is When Corporations Rule the World by David Korten, K-O-R-T-E-N, When Corporations Rule the World. And the other is The Transformation of American Law by Morton Horowitz, H-O-R-O-W-I-T-Z. He is professor of the chair of history of law at Harvard. And his first volume was published by Harvard, the next one by Oxford University Press. But in that study, I just regret that I didn't do more in the study of law, because what we're up against is largely the terrible, terrible limitations and distortions of our jurisprudence. Now, because of this, now, he shows there in his first volume, Transformation of American Law, how the legal profession, the judiciary, bonded with the entrepreneurial, commercial concerns at the very beginning of this country. The Transformation of American Law is from common law of the colonial period, which is derived from England, but immediately in the 19th century, and that was just after the Constitution came into power, the whole structure of this country moved toward the commercial industrial enterprise. And government, ever since then, has been supporting. Now, the second volume of that is particularly good. If you read the first and the last chapters of the first volume, you'll get the basic idea. But it's the corporation. We don't live in nations any longer. We live in a world of corporations. And corporations no longer have any allegiance to any country. And no country can set limits of what they do. They're not under control of any other human concern. On the other hand, the corporations, they own the world. Now, after the GATT treaties, after the World Trade Organization comes in, the corporations own the planet. They own the land. They own the legislatures. They own the legal profession is almost totally dedicated to support of the corporations. You see these big corporations now, hundreds and hundreds of lawyers, a single corporation, a single legal corporation supporting the commercial enterprise projects and the different things. It's
Thomas?
It makes a person really
You're going to have to hire a lawyer and sue me. I have to let these people have 10 minutes, okay?
Good.
10 minutes. Come back at 3. 1 minute to 3. Thank you.